All right, so now that we've created the delegate method for our table view so that we can detect when the user presses that last row that gets more quotes, we can call our function called buy premium quotes. And it's in this function that we're going to trigger the in-app purchase. So first of all, we're going to create a new constant that is going to be called our product ID. And that ID is the same as the ID that we put into App Store Connect. Under features, in-app purchases, we've got that product called premium quotes, and this is the product ID that we want. So I'm just going to copy it over to our code here, and I'm going to put it in just as a simple string. Now, this is the ID that we're going to use to hit up the Apple App Store to tell it what we want to buy, and so that the user gets charged the right amount, namely whatever it is that we've put in here, and that they can purchase, and that the funds go towards ourselves as our developer account. So now that we've got what we want to purchase, how are we going to purchase it? Well, in order to implement in-app purchases, the framework that we're going to be using is something called StoreKit. And StoreKit has all of the functionality that we'll need to implement in-app purchases for virtual products. So once we've added StoreKit, then we'll be able to tap into all of its functions and attributes. So inside our buy premium quotes function, the first thing we need to check is whether if the user can actually make a purchase. Because if they're on a phone that has parental controls enabled, then we won't be able to get them to make any sort of in-app purchases. And this is the way that Apple tries to keep your kids from running up the credit card bill and buying thousands of dollars worth of in-app purchases in Clash of Clans, for example. So the way to check for that is something called SK payment queue. And this is the queue of payment transactions to be processed by the App Store. And it has a method called can make payments. And this method returns a Boolean, so true or false, as to whether if the user is allowed to make payments. And that's exactly what we need to know. So if this returns true, then in that case, the user can make payments. And if it returns false, or rather else, then can't make payments. So it's a good idea while we're testing our app to just put in a print statement that says user can't make payments. There we go. But if they can make payments, then we can go ahead and trigger the next step of our in-app purchase request, which is to create a new request. So we're going to use a let to create a constant called payment request. And this is going to be a new object created from the class called SK mutable payment, which is a mutable request to the App Store to process payment for additional functionality, namely an in-app purchase. So this is where we're creating a new in-app purchase request, basically. And we're going to specify that this payment request is for the product with product identifier of whatever it is that we had up here, which is saved under this constant called product ID. So we're saying that we're making a request to purchase a new in-app purchase, and the product that we want is the one that has the product ID that we've specified. And finally, we tap into that SK payment queue again, and we grab the default payment queue, and we add this payment request to the queue. So payment request goes in there, and that's it. That's all the code that we need in order to implement our in-app purchase. Now, this is not the end of the tutorial, however, because we still need to figure out how we can detect when a payment has been successful so that we know that we can give them access to the extra information, or that when a payment has failed so that we don't accidentally give them access to all of our premium features even though they haven't paid for it. So in order to do that, we need to read a little bit about this payment business. So if you hold down Alt and click on SK Payment Queue, there's a quick doc of how this all works. So the summary is that this is a queue of payment transactions to be processed by the App Store. So of course you can add multiple payment requests to this queue. So you can purchase, 5 in-app purchases in the same go if you wanted to. And the discussion part says that the payment queue communicates with the App Store and presents the user a user interface, so a pop-up, so that they can enter their password and authorize the payment. Now, to process a payment, first add at least one observer object, which is called SK Payment Transaction Observer, to the queue. And then add a payment object, which is what we've done here, for the item that the user wants to purchase. And after the payment is fulfilled, the queue updates the transaction object and then calls the observer so that it tells us that the transaction has been updated and whether if it failed or succeeded. So the next thing that we need to implement is this SK Payment Transaction Observer. And this has a delegate method. So we have to add the protocol of SK Payment Transaction Observer, which contains a set of methods that processes transactions, unlocks purchase functionality, and continue promoted in-app purchases. So that basically means that when we add this observer, then once the payment goes through and the user types in their username and password for the App Store and it was successful, then we'll get a message back telling us that it was successful, or if it failed, then we'll get a message saying that it failed, or a whole bunch of other things. So as soon as I add this protocol, you can see we get an error, and it says that in order to conform to this protocol, you have to add the delegate method. So let's get it to add it automatically. And the only delegate method that's required is this one, which is payment queue updated transactions. So this delegate method will inform us when the transactions have been updated in the payment queue. So let's move this down a little bit to the part where we've got our in-app purchase methods. And we're going to put it over here. And I'm going to just delete this placeholder that says code. Now, remember that whenever you add a new protocol and you want to use a delegate method, you have to declare a class as the delegate. So we want to declare this current class, the quote table view controller, as the delegate who's going to receive the messages from the SK Payment Transaction Observer when the transaction status changes. So inside view.did_load, we're going to add ourselves as the delegate. And the code for this is simply SK Payment Queue dot default, which is the default queue that we're using to process our payment request, dot add. And this adds an observer. So notice that when I write dot add, there's actually two methods that this object has. One is add an observer, and the other one is add the payment to be processed. Now, the only difference they have is the names of the parameters. And in Swift, this is perfectly legal. You can have the same method name, but as long as the parameter names for the methods are different, then they are treated as completely separate methods. So if you're coming from other programming languages, for example, C or C++, this should be familiar to you as well. So the one that we want is to add an observer. And this takes an object that is a SK Payment Transaction Observer. And by declaring ourselves as conforming to this protocol and implementing the required delegate method, then we are qualified to set ourselves, or this current class, as the observer. So now, whenever any changes happens to the payment transactions, it's going to contact our quote table view controller, and it's going to try and find this delegate method to trigger an update. Now, if you alt-click on this payment queue function, or search for it in Google or Stack Overflow or Apple Docs, you can see that we have a summary which tells an observer, which is this current class, that one or more transactions have been updated. So it gets triggered every single time the transaction status changes. But not only that, the application should process each transaction by examining the transaction's transaction state property. So this is the transactions that we get back, and it has a property apparently called transaction state. And if we click on transaction state, it tells us there's a whole bunch of transaction states we can get back. Namely, one is purchasing, being purchased by the App Store, purchased, so successfully processed payment, the money's going to hit your developer account and you are ready to release the premium products, failed. So the transaction failed, and you can check the error property to see what happened. Or restored, which is where, say, if a user buys a new phone and they download the apps all over again, they want to be able to restore the previous in-app purchases that they've made. So we're going to check for each of these cases in the transaction state inside this delegate method. Now, remember previously I said that the payment queue can contain any number of transactions. So if you were to purchase 3 in-app purchases all in one go, then all the transactions will get piled into this array of SK payment transactions. So in order to check each of these transactions, we're going to have to loop through it. So we're going to say for transaction in transactions, and that transactions comes from here. This one is just the variable we're creating to loop through these transactions. And for every transaction in all of the array of transactions, we're going to check if the current transaction that we're looping through dot transaction state is equal to dot purchased. And that means that it was a successful purchase. So user payment successful. Now, else if the transaction dot transaction state was actually something like dot failed, then in that case, something bad happened and payment failed. Now, this can also include if they clicked the cancel button and they didn't want to go ahead with the payment anymore. So now we have 2 if statements, one when it's successful and one when the transaction failed. So let's go ahead and add a print statement to show in the console when we test our app which case it is. So print transaction successful, print transaction failed. So now we're ready to test our in-app purchases. And remember what I said before, that you have to test it on a physical iPhone or iPad device. It can't be in the simulator. It doesn't work. And it won't tell you that it's not working or give you any logical errors. You just have to know that you have to use a physical device. Now, the other problem is that I've set this in-app purchase for my premium quotes to be 99 cents. And I don't really want to pay 99 cents every single time I want to test my app, right? So I don't want to use my normal Apple ID. So what's the workaround? Well, we can create a sandbox user that's just for testing these payments. So in the next lesson, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. And we're going to be testing our app and seeing whether if it worked.